Today we will be covering lesson 2.2, atoms interact and form molecules, to accompany Principles of Life, second edition for the AP course. We'll be covering pages 20 through 26 in your textbook. Please make sure to follow along from there. Now, when we talk about a chemical bond is defined as an attractive force that occurs between two separate molecules. So there are several types of chemical bonds that we're going to discuss in our lesson today. Now, when we examine table 2.1, table 2.1 in your text is on page 22. We are shown and given brief definitions of our different types of bonds. We're going to go into a little bit more detail about each of these, but we have them as an ionic attraction, covalent bonds, hydrogen bonds, hydrophobic interaction, and van der Waals forces. Okay, so let's start with covalent bonds. Now, a covalent bond will form when two atoms share a pair of electrons, meaning that it's two electrons involved. The atoms attain stability by having full outer shells. Each atom will contribute one member of the electron pair. That electron is then free to move about from one of the atoms or the other. We can see this in figure 2.2 on page 21 when two hydrogen atoms come together to form hydrogen gas. Those electrons move about around each one that's present. So we can see our electron comes in, it pairs in. This electron is not going to just stay with this one over here on the right. It can go between either. It can form this, figure 8 as it moves about from one to the next. So carbon atoms have 6 electrons, 4 in the outermost shell. They can form covalent bonds with 4 other atoms. Now, figure 2.3b on page 21 shows how carbon can do this. Now, in this case, we have methane gas, and in this case, it is sharing an electron with 4 separate hydrogen models. So this is the Bohr model, like we talked about in lesson 2.1. We have our structural formulas down here, the ball and stick model, and then the space filling model as well. Again, these are all different interpretations of the same basic thing that's happening. Now, table 2.2 is going to show the covalent bonding capacities of some biologically important elements. Okay, so what we're going to see here, and this is on page 22 in your text, you're going to find the number of covalent bonds that each one can find, hydrogen all the way up to phosphorus being 5. Okay, so some of the properties of molecules can be influenced by the characteristics of the covalent bond. So one of the things is orientation. Okay, what we mean by this is the length of the angle, whether it's very, very close, very, very distant, the angle of the bond itself, and then the direction of bonds between any two of the elements that are there at any point in time. Okay, so the strength or the stability of covalent bonds also vary. So covalent bonds are very strong, and it takes a lot of energy to break them. Think of things exploding. If we go back to that hydrogen gas is incredibly explosive. If a flame is exposed to it, it immediately ignites, and that is those bonds actually separating. Okay, so we do have multiple bonds as well. So a single covalent bond, we share 1 pair of electrons. Double, we share 2 pairs. And a triple, we share 3. So nitrogen gas down here at the bottom, this is inert nitrogen gas. This is what makes up 78% of the air that we breathe. Okay, so just around in the atmosphere, that's the gas that's there. Okay, so two atoms of different elements don't always share the electrons equally. Sometimes the elements where the electrons will spend more time around one of the elements than the other. This creates electronegativity. Okay, so water is a great example of this, and we can see this on page 22 in your text. Okay, we see the orientation and the electron sharing pairs between the electrons that are there. So when we look at some of these, okay, we have different electronegativity values. Okay, so oxygen being 3.4, carbon 2.6, all the way down with potassium at 0.8. Okay. So if atoms have similar electronegativities, they share electrons equally, okay, creating a non-polar covalent bond. So if atoms have different electronegativities, they form a polar covalent bond, as I was just discussing with water. So the partial charges that result from one polar covalent bond produce polar molecules, or a region in which the molecule or the larger molecules where it is slightly positive in one region, slightly positive and negative in another region, but still overall is neutral. Okay, the polarity of water molecules determines many of its unique properties. So the next one, hydrogen bonds. So we are on page 23 now. The attraction between the negative end of one molecule and the positive hydrogen end of the other molecule allow for them to be attracted together. Okay, they form between water molecules and within larger molecules as well. They're very, very weak bonds. We all know that when you move a glass around with water in it, that water will take shape because those bonds are relatively weak. Okay, so we can see right here in figure 2.4 that hydrogen bonds can form between or within molecules as well. So in this first part over here, we see that a hydrogen bond forms between two molecules because of the attraction between an atom with a partial negative charge on one molecule and a hydrogen of another positive, and the positive charge of another. So we see the hydrogen positive right here being attracted to the oxygen negative. Now, we also see in the second part that hydrogen bonds can form between different parts of the same larger molecule. So we have this large complex molecule right here. In this case, we have a CO group right here, this electronegative region of the oxygen being attracted to the H, the positive right here, the NH group. So hydrogen bonding contributes to properties of water that are incredibly significant for life. The first, water is said to be the universal solvent in living things. Water will dissolve most all substances, and it will allow for it to be distributed. Think of your circulatory system. The water that is in blood allows for nutrients and waste products to be transported throughout the body. Now, the next is the high heat capacity. So, water molecules form multiple hydrogen bonds. This contributes to high heat capacity, meaning that it takes a lot of uh, energy to raise the temperature of water. Okay, so at the bottom of page 23 in your text, you can see liquid water. You can see all of the interactions that are here occurring. And again, this is just a fraction of a drop of water, in an entire ocean, showing all those interactions that are there. So, as I was saying, a lot of heat energy is required to raise the temperature of water, and the heat energy will break those hydrogen bonds, allowing it to become water vapor. So think of it when you boil water on your stove, as that water boils off, that steam that's created, that's because those hydrogen bonds are being broken. In organisms, the presence of water shields them from fluctuations in environmental temperature. This is why when it's hot outside, we need to drink water. Okay, we are replacing the sweat that's lost, and it also helps to bring our body temperature back down. So water also has a high heat of evaporation. So meaning a lot of heat energy is required to change water from liquid to gaseous state. When we think about it, there's not very many substances that are liquid at room temperature. I know we have some cooking oils, some petroleum, hydrocarbons, diesel, gasoline, stuff like that. But most everything else around us is either in solid form or in liquid form. Therefore, evaporation has a cooling effect on the environment. Sweating cools the body, as we all know. We're in the middle of a historic heat wave right now. And that sweat that we have, it may make us feel kind of gross, but it does help cool our bodies down. Okay, so it also gives the ability to have a strong cohesion force. Now, with cohesion, that is when water molecules resist coming apart when placed under tension. I'm sure you all recall in elementary school how many drops of water can you put on top of a nickel or a penny. That tests cohesion, just how much water can be put there before the force of gravity overtakes the cohesive force. And likewise, we also have a strong adhesive force. So water does stick to things fairly well. This is why, something gets wet, we can take a paper towel to it and we try and wipe it up. But the water does still stay there because sometimes the surface has a higher adhesive force than the rag or paper towel we're trying to use. Okay, so we can see this demonstrated here on page 24 in our text. We have these drops of water, interestingly, both on top and on bottom. So on top, we're seeing the cohesive force that's coming into play, and on the bottom, we have the adhesive force because the water is sticking to the bottom of the leaf here. Okay, so next is surface tension. I'm sure some of you probably experienced this as a kid when you went swimming and you did a belly flop into the pool. Water has an incredibly high surface tension, meaning that the surface are hydrogen bonded to other molecules below them, okay, making the surface very difficult to puncture. Okay, this is also what allows a lot of our water insects to float, so to say, on the surface. It is actually that their weight does not exceed the force of surface tension. Okay, so any polar molecule can interact with any other polar molecule through hydrogen bonds. If something is hydrophilic, that means it is water loving. So when something is hydrophilic, when we put it into water, it will separate. Think of sugar, for example. So if you put sugar into water, the sugar, we've said, it dissolves, but it actually dissociates. It separates into its individual components until the solution becomes saturated. So the nonpolar molecules are said to be hydrophobic. So this is like oil. We try to add oil to water. We know that those two will never mix. Okay, so we can see this demonstration here with figure 2-5 on page 24 in your text. Okay, so when one atom is much more electronegative than the other, a complete transfer of electrons may occur. When this happens, we will see typically elements will become more stable because we are donating electrons. As a result of this, two ions are formed where we have an actual change in charge. One will become positive, one will become negative. Okay, so the interaction of sodium and chlorine that we see here in figure 2-6 on page 25 shows that chlorine, having 17 electrons, wants to have its outer shell filled. Now, sodium, on the other hand, it only has one electron. Now, we can use some simple logic here and say that it is much easier to remove one electron than it would to try and take 7. As a result of this, sodium will donate one of its electrons to chlorine, forming table salt, sodium chloride as we call it. Now, it's important to note that when we talk about our ions, our cations and anions, when they are on their own, they have very different properties. So, for example, sodium is highly reactive with water. If you were to place pure sodium in water, it would actually explode. Chlorine, in its natural form, is a gas. If you were to inhale pure chlorine, it would be enough to kill you. Okay, so when we create these positively charged ions by donating these electrons, we call it a cation. If we are gaining that electron, we call it an anion. And because of this, we have ionic attractions, which result from the electrical attractions between ions with these opposite charges. These are relatively weak, and we typically see them in salts. Okay, so we see this cation here, this anion here, and they will be attracted to each other. But again, it's a relatively weak attraction. Okay, now, lastly, we're going to talk about functional groups real quick. We have a really good figure 2.7 on page 25 in your text that are going to give a quick run through of these. Okay, so one molecule may contain many of these functional groups that will determine molecular shape and reactivity, getting things done within the cell. So we can see here our hydroxyl groups. We have our properties of each, aldehydes, our keto groups, our carboxyl groups, amino groups, phosphate group, and sulfhydryl groups. Okay, so you'll want to review the properties of these as we move into our organic chemistry. Okay, so on page 26, to close, we can see our macromolecules being formed by the process of polymerization, which we'll cover in the next lesson. Okay, so as these begin to form, okay, we put them into four groups. Excuse me. We have our proteins, carbohydrates, nucleic acids, and lipids. Okay, proteins being formed from 20 different amino acids, carbohydrates from linking our monosaccharides and to form longer and longer, more complex chains called polysaccharides. Nucleic acids formed from our 4 nucleotide monomers to form DNA, RNA, all those that we're familiar with, and then lipids forming our fats, oils, waxes, things like that. Okay, so we do this through condensation or hydrolysis reaction. Condensation will remove water and will link monomers together. Hydrolysis will require the addition of water to break these down. I want to be clear, both of these are active reactions. They do require the use of energy. So with condensation, we can see here in figure 2-8 on page 26 in your text, we are taking a water molecule, another water molecule, and we are combining them. Okay, ironically, or a one molecule with this H and OH group. These two monomers, we bring them together. We were removing water, and then we have the opposite when we are using a water molecule to separate them. Okay, so with our hydrolysis reaction, we add water, we separate them, and we break them down. So if you have any questions, make sure to put them in the comments below and make sure to answer your review questions before class.